On May 10, 1933, in dozens of cities across Germany, students and Nazi Party officials gathered books they had deemed subversive and un-German, and stood in lines, waiting to throw the tomes into the flames of raging bonfires Nazi soldiers had set in the middle of town squares across the country. Upwards of 80,000 books were burned that night. The act was a concerted and symbolic effort to tell the people of Germany and the people of the world that a new Germany was being born, a pure Germany. That night, the students that were gathered around the flames swore an oath to combat and destroy subversive and un-German literature. 6 years later, Germany would invade Poland, starting what would become the deadliest conflict in world history. In the apocryphal words of German poet Heinrich Heine, whose books were burned that night, along with books by Ernest Hemingway, Helen Keller, and Jack London, where they burn books, they will also ultimately burn people.
First thing every totalitarian regime does, along with confiscation and mutilation of reality, is confiscation of history and confiscation of culture. I think they all happen almost simultaneously. They surely happened in my experience when I was living in Iran.
In Florida last year, 3 laws were passed aimed at controlling access to information and educational materials. The Parental Rights in Education Act constrains instruction on gender and sexuality in schools, which has led school libraries to remove books with LGBTQ characters in an attempt to comply. The language in these bills is murky and broad, leaving it up to librarians and schools to figure out how to comply or face steep criminal penalties, including up to 5 years in prison for accidentally giving the wrong book to a child. Which books are wrong? Who knows? Approval is now required by certified media specialists before books and materials are allowed back into schools to ensure each book is age-appropriate and free of pornographic content. According to the president of the Florida Association for Media and Education, it's a whole new level of fear. It has led to the banning and removal of a sweeping range of books, including, interestingly, Ernest Hemingway, Helen Keller, and Jack London. Is it a coincidence that some of the same books burned by the Nazis are now being banned by a vocal minority of parents and lawmakers hell-bent on shoving their ideology down the throats of everyone around out of fear that their children might be introduced to ideas that don't conform to their sanitized, inaccurate, white supremacist version of history? I don't think so. The current book bans that are sweeping the United States are a symptom of a larger problem, one that's repeated itself throughout history, wherever one group sought to impose religious, moral, or political control over the masses. This is a problem that implicates First Amendment freedoms, human rights, and the ability of future generations to think for themselves. What's behind the current surge of book bans? Why are these apparent curbs to free speech and expression being allowed to go unchecked? And what are we to do about it? Why are conservatives so obsessed with banning books? Roll the intro. Thank you to Factor for partnering with me on today's video. Have you ever thought to yourself, wow, I really don't want to cook dinner tonight. I'm hot. I'm exhausted. I deserve a little treat, but I also don't want to spend a truckload on takeout. What's a girl to do? Factor. That's what. With Factor's ready-made, fresh, never frozen meals, you can skip the grocery store, the prep, and the cleanup too. Their meals are ready in just 2 minutes, and they are literally, and I cannot stress this enough, so delicious. Y'all know if you follow me a lot that I have been hitting the gym lately, okay? I've been getting my workout on, I've been adding some muscles, I've been getting swole, okay? But going to the gym takes energy. And it requires protein. And I love to refuel with Factor. And they have tons of meal plans to choose from, including Protein Plus meals with 30 grams of protein or more per meal. They have over 34 plus chef-prepared, dietitian-approved weekly options. So there's always something new to try. Plus, they offer snacks, and you know that I love snacks, including really delicious fruit smoothies. I recently tried their loaded bacon cheddar chicken, and boy howdy was it tasty! Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code Leeja50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Thanks, Factor! Banning books that don't align with the power-hungry's ideals of religion, morality, politics, or social order is nothing new. In fact, it's really fucking old. In the year 35, Caligula, emperor of the Romans, banned the reading of the Odyssey by Homer, by then a 300-year-old story, because he thought the epic poem was dangerous because it expressed Greek ideals of freedom. In 1524, William Tyndale translated the New Testament from Latin to English. Thousands of copies were publicly burned on orders of London's Roman Catholic bishop because church authorities insisted that the Bible can only be available in Latin, so that only church leaders were able to read and interpret it to the masses. Giving the people the ability to read the Bible themselves would be dangerous. William Tyndale was strangled and burned at the stake for his English translation of the Bible. English businessman and founder of the colony that is now Quincy, Massachusetts, named Thomas Morton, was a vocal critic of Puritan beliefs, and in 1637 he wrote a book about it. His New English Canon is likely the first book ever banned in the United States. In the slave-holding southern United States between 1730 and 1834, anti-literacy laws made it illegal for enslaved and free people of color to read or write. Southern slave states enacted these laws to prohibit anyone from teaching enslaved and free people of color to read or write out of fear of slave rebellion and as a means of imposing ultimate power and control. By the 1850s, anti-slavery sentiment had grown to a fever pitch in parts of the United States. In response, multiple states outlawed the expression of anti-slavery sentiments. Abolitionist author Harriet Beecher Stowe defied these laws in 1851 when she published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel aimed at exposing the evils of slavery, and which is thought by some scholars to have been one of the instigating factors that led to the U.S. Civil War. After the Civil War, a man named Anthony Comstock settled in New York City. He was appalled at the rapid urbanization of the United States, and he decided that it was his sole mission in life to refortify what he considered to be true American morality, meaning this guy was a real buzzkill. In 1873, he organized the New York chapter of the Society for the Suppression of Vice, which crusaded against pornography and was instrumental to the passage of the law known as the Comstock Act, which made illegal the transport and delivery of obscene, lewd, or lascivious materials. Comstock was appointed special agent in the U.S. Post Office, giving him the power to cull the mail for improper materials and destroy anything he deemed to be obscene. He also had the power to arrest individuals for sending obscene materials through the mail. He was even against things like anatomy textbooks and was especially against adventure books and romance novels because he believed that they corrupted the American youth. Sound familiar? He also hated gambling, and he opposed the use of birth control medications and devices, and played a role in the late 19th century criminalization of abortion by various state legislatures. Numerous doctors were arrested and convicted for supplying women just with materials explaining pregnancy and how to prevent it. Because this boring guy with absolutely zero medical qualifications decided that it was obscene. Numerous authors would be arrested under the act too, including Ezra Heywood, who wrote a book arguing that women should have control over their bodies, and Margaret Sanger, who was then writing a sex education column for a socialist newspaper. Very scandalous. By 1878, groups like the National Liberal League and the National Defense Association presented Congress with a petition with more than 50,000 signatures requesting repeal of the Comstock Act, arguing that the law had been enforced to destroy the liberty of conscience in matters of religion, against the freedom of the press, and to the great hurt of the learned professions. The petition was denied. Comstock would go on to pen newspaper articles and lecture in colleges about the waywardness of college students. His ideas and methods were especially influential to one law student he lectured by the name of J. Edgar Hoover. Ever heard of him? Hoover would go on to serve as the director of the FBI for 48 years, where he became known for his questionable and illegal tactics to gain information, including his love of illegally surveilling U.S. citizens with whom he disagreed, including his efforts to try to prove that Martin Luther King Jr. was a communist tool. Love that. The Comstock Act has never been fully repealed by Congress, though portions of it have been overturned by Supreme Court cases. Anti-abortion activists have recently tried to revive the law to argue in favor of banning the delivery of abortion pills through the mail. And if you can prosecute anyone for putting anything in the mail related to abortion, that's a big deal, because there is no abortion in the United States that takes place without something being put in the mail. Comstock died in 1915, and I'm sure he would be absolutely giddy to know that his law is still a thorn in the side of people doing obscene things 150 years after its passage. And as we've seen, where there's a vocal group of people that is trying to control the masses, there are book bannings. So the Jim Crow South was another particular hotbed for book censorship. One group, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, successfully pushed for a ban on school textbooks that didn't offer a sympathetic enough view of the South's loss in the Civil War. They also banned The Rabbit's Wedding, a 1954 children's book that depicted a white rabbit marrying a black rabbit. because people thought it would encourage interracial relationships. Think of the children! In the 1930s, Harold Rugg was a prominent publisher of textbooks that pointed out inequalities, especially Depression-era income inequality, as well as other inequities faced in America, and sought to solve those problems via education. This, of course, was met with harsh criticism from people who believed that these questions were inappropriate for children and were in fact un-American, subversive, and potentially communist. Remember from last week how anything that wasn't a perfect, whitewashed Christian version of history was considered subversive? This was interestingly around the same time that the Nazis burned books for being subversive and un-German. Indeed, some school boards banned and even burned copies of Harold Rugg's textbooks. To put this into context, this was happening right after the early 20th century shift in the history profession towards professionalization. Professors getting PhDs, learning to do archival research, and beginning to ask some very difficult questions like, if the American Revolution was a fight for freedom, why were there also 4 million enslaved people at the same time? And these questions made people feel uncomfortable, so they were met with backlash. Similarly, there's been a recent change over the past couple decades in the way that American history is taught in the mainstream. The new narratives coming out present a sometimes uncomfortable retelling of American history, often through the lens of people who've been marginalized throughout that history. And those new versions of history challenge this heroic narrative of liberty and freedom for all that many people cling to in a way that makes especially the most powerful, that is, straight white Christians, very uncomfortable. And while the First Amendment protects the freedom of adults to say and read nearly whatever they want, not so for our nation's children. And since children are the last bastion of totalitarian control that conservatives have to exercise, though for some of them that would expand if they had their way, children become the battleground upon which the culture wars in the United States play out. The First Amendment says that Congress or the state cannot establish an official religion or prohibit the free exercise of religion, nor can they abridge the freedom of speech or of the press. The First Amendment, however, is not absolute. It does not grant anyone the absolute right to say anything they want or produce any kind of media they want, no matter what it is. There are very specific limits to free speech that have been found to weigh in the best interest of society, to be so important as to necessitate the curbing of free speech. For example, speech that instigates violent acts is not protected. Defamatory speech is often not protected. Speech that infringes on another's copyrights or other intellectual property is not protected. There are a lot of caveats and asterisks attached to the First Amendment, and despite the pronouncements of many out-of-touch billionaires, there are few, if any, true First Amendment absolutists out there, because a world where the freedom to say and do literally anything is protected without question is not a world most of us want to live in. Ask, for example, Elon Musk, who loves to declare himself a First Amendment absolutist while simultaneously making his employees sign non-disclosure agreements and suing people for defamation. Most people love free speech only so far as it serves them. The same is true of conservatives who, on the one hand, will scream all day about their absolute right to say the most insulting, horrific shit, while also denouncing books where 2 male penguins get married. Where they'll be literally up in arms about the removal of racist Dr. Seuss books and cancel culture, while simultaneously pushing to remove books that even so much as mention the existence of gay people. And of course, with the Dr. Seuss example, sometimes book bans are the work of liberals. Honestly, after doing research for this video, I don't think the idea of banning a Dr. Seuss book because it shows racist stereotypes is necessarily a good idea. It's an opportunity to learn from the past, but I think once you start banning one book, that can snowball into banning a lot of speech that's supposed to be protected under the First Amendment. The only place where it seems to me to be appropriate is where books, especially books purporting to be non-fiction textbooks, are factually inaccurate. For example, in the 1960s, the NAACP worked to change school textbooks that were teaching about slavery as a benevolent force that helped civilize the savage African race. This is a factually inaccurate representation of the brutality of the slave trade and of the civilizations in Africa during the slave trade. But where the First Amendment protects even the most inflammatory speech, it operates differently in schools and where our nation's children are involved. And because of this, conservatives have spotted an opening for them to impose their specific worldview and frame it through the lens of their favorite rallying cry. What about the children? In 1965, in Des Moines, Iowa, 5 students wore black armbands to school one day to protest the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. This act led to the landmark United States Supreme Court case, Tinker v. Des Moines, in which the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that neither students nor teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. The court took the position that school officials could not prohibit speech or expression only on the suspicion that the speech might disrupt the learning environment. Awesome! Students have First Amendment rights in schools. Cool! cool. Throughout the 60s and 70s, the United States saw a drop in instances of book bans, along with the rise in more explicit and true-to-life art. Artists and authors had freedom to experiment, consumers were beginning to unclutch their pearls, and sex was mainstream in many popular novels. But then, enter Ronald Reagan, because of course. Reagan encouraged the reemergence of those classic American ideals of being white and rich and going to church. And with that came a surge in people unhappy with books in schools and libraries that were depicting what were, frankly, more realistic depictions of life. The number of challenges to books made by school boards and libraries soared. There were so many newly banned books that the American Library Association began Banned Book Week, a week in late September that highlights commonly banned books to bring attention to the curbs to freedom of expression and speech that banning books can cause. Banned Book Week continues to this day and is as important now as it was when it started 40 years ago, if not more so. At that same time, the Supreme Court made a new ruling taking on book bans head-on. In Board of Education of Island Trees Union Free School District versus Pico in 1982, a divided court ruled 5-4 that it's not against the First Amendment for public schools to bar books that are pervasively vulgar or not right for the curriculum. However, the court added the caveat that books can't be removed simply because the objectors dislike the ideas contained in those books. This decision was narrow and applied only to the removal of books from school library shelves, but it was enough to give would-be book banners a foot in the door for controlling the narrative and exercising power over schools and all the librarians, teachers, and students in them. The caveats to free speech in schools that this ruling carved out, specifically where books are vulgar or not right for the curriculum, have been used liberally by those trying to ban books in our schools. Anything discussing the human body, sexuality, or gender could be deemed vulgar or not age-appropriate by some. Anything discussing violence and racism can be argued to be not right for the curriculum. And states are then able to impose those bans via laws that criminally punish school librarians, frankly, the most innocent, helpful, and positive people that our children come into contact with during the school day. Librarians were my lifeline in like the first grade when I was a weird gifted student with few friends, so my teacher would let me go by myself to the library for the first hour of every day because I just discovered chapter books and couldn't believe the worlds that opened up for me. And librarians were the stable force that was always there guiding me to my next adventure. School libraries didn't foment this revolutionary spirit in me. Okay, I was reading like Harold and the Purple Crayon and the Boxcar Kids. No, the revolutionary spirit sprang forth inside of me when, for example, I went on a field trip to the state capitol and saw hateful conservatives picking against gay rights and was like, that seems wrong. It also sprang forth inside of me when I learned about the counterculture movement and decided I wanted to be a hippie and learn about egalitarianism and rock and roll. So the fact that librarians are now the target of these laws shows that it's about power and control and not about protecting our kids. Not really. The same way the US saw a growth of calls for book bans as a backlash to urbanization and industrialization in the late 1800s, to the professionalization of the history profession and the examination of class structures during the Great Depression, and to the relaxing of social constraints during the counterculture movements of the 60s and 70s, we're now seeing a conservative backlash to the retelling of history and examination of life through the lens of those who are marginalized. With all progress comes the backlash by those who benefit from the stalling of progress. We're at a critical point in this country's history where a vocal minority have been given legitimacy through things like the election of Donald Trump, numerous election-denying officials, and the proliferation of disinformation online, where fear-mongering has been turned into a science on Fox News so parents everywhere can be whipped into a frenzy over problems that don't exist, where conspiracy theories have gone mainstream, and where wealth inequality was exacerbated and laid bare during the worst pandemic in a century. And the backlash we're seeing is specific, one that's rooted in the backlashes of the past. It's against a specific kind of content seen as teaching children, especially white children, that there's something wrong with America. That truth is uncomfortable, especially for those who have benefited most from the wrongs of the past. All Florida librarians are now required to undergo specialization training so they can properly vet books. Specialization training taught by the state. The state that is so concerned with state-funded schools indoctrinating their children is teaching librarians which indoctrination is okay and which isn't. But that's because it's not about protecting children from indoctrination. Not really. It's about keeping children from being introduced to ideas contrary to what a vocal minority of parents believe in, thinly veiled as parents' rights and individual freedoms. The list of rules for these new Floridian media specialists includes things like a avoiding unsolicited theories that may lead to student indoctrination. What does that mean? No one knows. Media specialists must also consider the age of the students who could access material, but did Florida hire child psychologists or anyone with any expertise on child development and age appropriateness to create this training? It's unclear. The closest thing I've read to a definition on this was some lawmaker saying, would you be willing to read it out loud in public? If not, then it's not appropriate for children, which is asinine. I personally would be embarrassed to read The Care and Keeping of You out loud in public, but when I was 12, that book was pivotal for explaining to me what the fuck was going on with my body, and what my boobies might look like at different stages of puberty, plus how to insert a tampon, including accurate anatomical drawings. When I say that book was pivotal to my tween development, but I would not be caught dead reading that thing aloud in public. What a stupid, arbitrary fucking rule. Other arbitrary guidance for media specialists include that materials should serve an educational purpose, and that specialists consider the broad racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, and cultural diversity of the students of this state. Again, no definitions given, just think about it. One section of the training also tells staffers that instructional material should not contain any matter reflecting unfairly upon persons because of their race, color, creed, national origin, ancestry, sex, religion, disability, socioeconomic status, or occupation. Note that it doesn't say discriminating against people. It says reflecting unfairly on people because of their race, etc. This is coded language meant to say that the books shouldn't make white people feel bad about being white, because if you mention the horrific shit white people have done, that it'll, I don't know, hurt their feelings, indoctrinate them. If the truth counts as indoctrination, then we have a problem here. These book bans are not unique to Florida and have increased dramatically in the past 2 years, spurred on by bills like the ones passed there or the one in Utah passed last year banning sensitive materials in public schools. Language like that, which is vague and provides little guidance to those tasked with complying with them, mainly our school librarians, has the cumulative effect of chilling access to educational materials, and most importantly, books. Out of fear of not complying, which could result in literal jail time, many schools and librarians and teachers are taking broad-based approaches to removal of books, meaning entire shelves are left empty across the country in this nation's schools. And some states are passing laws that make that chilling effect especially acute. In Iowa last week, the House introduced a bill that would make it illegal for a person affiliated with a public school or public library to knowingly spread material the person knows or reasonably should know is obscene or harmful to minors. The bill would carry a penalty of up to 5 years in prison, but most important is the part where the bill would allow a parent or guardian to bring a civil action against any public school or library if their child receives obscene material, with the minimum civil penalties of $10,000 plus court fees. This means that schools, librarians, and teachers could be sued over and over again by parents who decide that they gave their kid an obscene book. If that parent wins, that's at least $10,000 in damages plus court fees, but even if the parent loses, every lawsuit is time and resources that we all know public schools do not have to give. Because of this, if this bill becomes law, schools in Iowa are going to have to self-censor to an unimaginable degree to avoid even the whiff of a future potential lawsuit. And children will absolutely lose out in this scenario. On May 1st of this year, PEN America, a nonprofit whose mission is to unite writers and their allies to celebrate creative expression and defend the liberties that make it possible, filed a lawsuit against Escambia County School District and School Board in Florida, asking the court to require the school to return banned books to the school library shelves. A press release by PEN America says that, according to the lawsuit, the school board's removal and restriction of access to books discussing race, racism, and LGBTQ identities against the recommendations of the District Review Committee charged with evaluating book challenges violates the First Amendment. And by ignoring these recommendations, the school district made it clear that its interests are in censoring certain ideas and viewpoints, not in education and pedagogy, and that it's willing to allow an extremist minority of parents mainly to substitute its political agenda for the judgment of educators and parents. The lawsuit further contends that the school district and school board are violating the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution because the books being singled out are disproportionately books by non-white and LGBT LGBTQ authors, and often address themes or topics related to race and LGBTQ identity. Most books targeted for banning in 2021, according to the American Library Association, were by or about Black or LGBTQIA people, and state legislators have also targeted books that they believe make students feel guilt or anguish based on their race, or imply that students of any race or gender are inherently bigoted. The press release goes on to say that again and again, the movement to ban books is driven by a vocal minority demanding censorship. At the same time, a 2022 poll found that over 70% of parents oppose book banning, yet the bans continue. So why are conservatives so obsessed with banning books? We've already seen that children are the ones who lose the most when adults fight over what books are appropriate for them. They lose out when it comes to their freedom of speech and expression. They lose out on the fundamental human development that comes when you're exposed to new and different ideas. And they lose out on the power of representation and seeing someone who looks like you reflected in your books and media. And they lose out because instead of focusing on their education, their educators have to focus on a small faction of vocal, angry parents who are making their lives hell, and now potentially maybe going to literal prison. Last year, fewer than half of Florida's 10th graders passed the state's English exam. This is not about the children. This is about power and control at the expense of the children. This is about imposing a specific worldview that conservatives fear is being lost. Because it is. We've moved beyond the idea that America is a perfect nation, land of the free, home of the brave. We all know the American dream is dead. And thank God. Now, instead of parading around pretending we live in some capitalist utopia, we can actually roll up our sleeves and have difficult conversations, including with our children, about what the world actually looks like for them. And that world includes non-binary kids, and lesbian moms, and sex, and violence, and racism, and yes, even gay penguins. Here's a few things you can do to help. Donate or become a member to PEN America to help their legal fight. Play an active role in your child's school to help balance the voices of bigoted parents trying to impose their worldview on your children. Get a library card for yourself and your kid at your local public library. More library cards shows interest and can lead to more funding. Read books to your kids, especially the banned ones. I've linked the American Library Association's official list of the top 13 banned books from 2022 below. Give the books as gifts to your nieces and nephews. Check your state's laws regarding banned books. I've linked some info below, and call your state lawmakers. Please, for the love of God, vote. Make sure you vote. Make sure you vote in school board members and local officials that support freedom of speech and expression for our students and in schools. And make sure that Ron fucking DeSantis doesn't become our next president. If you like this video, you'll also like the one I did last week all about why America is so obsessed with communism. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, especially my newest and royal patrons. And thank you especially to multi-platinum patron Brett Piontek. If you'd like personal content about my dog, show notes, and behind the scenes stuff, sign up over on Patreon using the link below. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye!